In my series on A Beginner's Guide to Building Better Worlds, today I'll be discussing Chapter 4, which is entitled Modernity, Coloniality, and Indigenous Realities. So let's begin. So in the current state of the world, with increasing disparity of rich and poor, with the environmental threats and threats to sustaining life, the authors start this chapter by posing three questions in relation to the world in which we live in. The kind of world in which we live in, if you followed the previous chapter on neoliberalism, we do understand that there is a specific kind of capitalism which is in practice, which is still extractive and exploitative. So most of the time, this system offers itself as absolutely the only way of existing in the world. So against that imperative, there are three questions that come to everyone's mind, but which the authors articulate. And those questions are alternative futures possible, alternatives to the current regime of neoliberalism? What might these futures look like? And how might we bring these futures to fruition? These are the three questions that are addressed in this chapter, not answered. You would see as you read the book that our authors are pretty careful because they understand alongside you and me that there are no neat answers to these intractable problems. But these are the three questions that they pose to us as readers, but also attempt to answer in this chapter. In the first section of the chapter, the authors explain to us, and I think pretty clearly, as to why it is important to focus on indigenous struggles and see them as knowledge production. And they give us two reasons. One, that indigenous people have suffered at the hands of modernity and capitalism, actually suffered the most historically, and that they are still targeted and still suffer in the far reaches of the world as target populations of exploitation by the current phase of neoliberal capital. Now, the authors are also careful in reminding us that they do not see indigenous populations all over the world as a monolithic group, and they are not a monolithic group, but their struggles, wherever they are in the world, are against the advances and destruction of capitalism. Another important concept that they share with us in this section of the chapter is the concept of radical hope. And that radical hope is connected to the struggle against capitalism and its rapacious nature and rapacious march, despite the odds against the indigenous people, including the Zapatistas. And that means that instead of despair, which is sort of a natural outcome when you're face to face against implacable forces, there is a kind of hope in resistance, a hope in creating change. Now remember, in the very first part of this chapter, our authors refer to Paulo Freire, right? And his idea of thematic understanding of any given culture, and within that finding the themes that keep the people in place, but those themes are generative. So radical hope then is also pretty Freirean because it is connected to community, their understanding of the world in which they live in, but also their struggles to transform the world into a more sustainable and maybe a compassionate world. The next section is about the MCD group, Modernity, Coloniality, and Decoloniality. And in my opinion, as a scholar of post-colonial studies, this is a deeply insightful reference to a powerful group of scholars of Latin America, including Walter Minuolo, right, whose famous book, The Darker Side of Modernity, actually sort of launched the decolonial thought. And what the authors are highlighting here is that rise of modernity. If you ask anyone in the dominant West what was rise of modernity, or if you even walk into a classroom where rise of modernism and capitalism is taught, the first things that come to your mind are rationalism, science, a destruction of superstition, development of democracies, human rights, women's rights. These are the tropes associated with modernity. But what the scholars of decolonialism or decolonization, like people like Walter Minuolo and others that our authors cite, they basically are telling us, they are complicating our perception of modernity. Because just as modernity becomes a thing or rises in the West, it immediately also unleashes its other, coloniality. Colonies and the rise of colonial expansion, creation of colonized subjects, slavery and enslavement of people are not aberrations of modernity. They are productions of modernity. They are products of modernity. And that is what people like Walter Minuolo and others who talk about modernity and its darker side as coloniality emphasize. And once we learn this lesson, that the moment someone invokes modernity, it is not just rationality and democracy and egalitarianism, it has millions upon millions of people subjugated, destroyed, and plundered, and that they are connected. So what then becomes important isn't just to talk about Western science and Western democracies and rule of reason and enlightenment, but also what it unleashes on the people who are considered other, but those others are necessary for Europe to centralize itself as the center of humanity and center of subjecthood. And that is decolonial studies in one way. So from there, the authors give us a brief genealogy of modernity, not in terms of how science rises and rationality rises, but what happens in the early mercantile phases of capitalism. How are the indigenous people viewed? How are they treated? How are their lives and societies destroyed in West's march towards modernity? But also how the first subjects, the people who were subjugated first, were during the phases of the mercantile capital by Spain and Portugal and later by the others. America and Native American humans, subjects, were the first one to face the brunt of that darker side of modernity. They are the ones who are created as this other who could be controlled, destroyed, but against whom the idea of a Eurocentric self, a European subject, could be posited and could be created. And that's a very important and insightful part of the book. So what we learn then in this section on genealogy of modernity, the authors tell us that this is not an exhaustive account. And of course, no one can give us an exhaustive account of how the darker impact of modernity unfolds in the colonies. But the first place where the European way of thinking the world has disastrous consequences is the Americas, right? The Caribbean and then the Americas. And they give us an account of how the natives, the indigenous people, were viewed, whether they were considered human or not. The issue was even debated by Catholic Church, by theologians. So they give us an account of a famous debate held between Las Casas, who was the Bishop of Chiapas, and the opposing group led by Sepulveda. And the debate is called Valladolid debate. What was discussed in this debate was whether or not the natives, the indigenous people of Americas, who were, of course, being controlled and destroyed by the landholders from Europe, mostly Spain and Portugal, right? Whether they were humans or not, their very humanity was under discussion. And Las Casas, of course, being a strong proponent of indigenous rights, was absolutely suggesting that not only are these people humans, they are free and independent, whereas the opposing side was of the view that they were probably not fully human and hence didn't deserve to be treated as such. Now, this debate, it is not just an armchair debate. The debate ends inconclusively, but imagine that these Europeans are discussing the very humanity of millions upon millions of people whose lives were impacted by the early colonization of Americas, whose lives were destroyed, right? And who had a different way of looking at the world. The point here is that in the process of unfolding of modernity, Europe also constitutes itself as the center of reason, as the center of civilization, but in the process of doing so, they are performing the most uncivilized acts of destroying people, enslaving people. Now, if you have read Howard Zinn's A People's History of United States, he relies on Las Casas' account of how the natives were treated, how greedy the Europeans were, and how would they extract labor and gold from the indigenous people. So what we learn then through this brief foray into a genealogy of modernity and coloniality is that coloniality emerges alongside of modernity, and the impact of it, while the Europeans were spewing about human rights and human dignity, the impact of it was destructive for the Americas. And that's why it's important to study and learn about the indigenous struggles of the American continent, because they were the first ones to have faced the European onslaught in such a destructive way. And maybe in doing so, we can learn their modes of resistance, which is a form of knowledge. How did they resist historically, and how are they resisting right now? That is what I get from this section of the chapter. So the next section is about the second stage of rise of capitalism and rise of modernity, and that is when the industrial capitalism rises. If you look at it domestically, let's say in England, and the authors mention the Enclosures Act. What was that? Okay, so before the land is enclosed by the large landholders, the peasants lived on the lands owned by, any lord, either rented the land or lived and gave their free labor to the lord. But they would always have a piece of land separate, which was called the commons. And the commons was land where the landholder didn't make use of the land, and the peasants could grow their food and graze their animals there. Now, the Enclosures Act made it possible for the landlords to enclose their lands. And the reason was simple, because they had moved from pure agriculture to wool economy. And so they felt the need to enclose the lands, to keep their sheep grazing on the land or whatever. But when they enclosed the land, they also enclosed the commons. So the peasant lost access to the commons. That is when they started starving, right? And they started moving into the cities. Now that's exactly when capitalism is rising, industries are rising. So here, not only are industries rising and there are no labor laws, there are millions of uprooted peasants who need to sell their labor. And it is that exploitation that is built into the rise of capitalism, right? Now remember, all the rights that you, me, and everyone else have as workers, maybe material workers or intellectual laborers, every single right, we fought for that. So the second stage, the industrial rise of industries, is also built on exploitation, and that is what we learn in this section. And then the authors bring us to neoliberalism. Right now, the system that exists right now, which is extractive, which is also built on exploitation. Now, we are no longer within the confines of nation states, right? Capitalism goes wherever it can find cheap labor. How do you find cheap labor? You go to places where the labor laws are weak, where people are either owned by a landlord or where people do not have many rights, and you extract their labor for whatever you want to produce. Neoliberalism also is exploitative because it goes searching for natural resources, extracts them, in the process destroys the local communities and the local environment. If you look at the Zapatista movement, the rise of the Zapatista movement coincided with the enactment of the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. And so it was symbolic, because here were an indigenous people opposed to the extractive policies of this new treaty, rising up against not just their own state, but against this system. There is 500 years of exploitation behind that, but also 500 years of struggle. So that's why it is important to study the indigenous struggles, but also to go to the Zapatistas, because not only do they have a history of having fought against European aggression and national aggression, but they are also one of the many movements in the world who are indigenous and who define their actions and their praxis in opposition to the destructive aspects of modernity and neoliberal capitalism. So that's why the last section of the book takes us to the Zapatista movement to answer the three questions the authors had raised in the beginning. So the Zapatistas understand neoliberal capitalism as a destructive system, partially through their lived experiences, right? Because they have borne the impact of neoliberal policies on their own communities. They also see it as a system that increases destruction and pain in the world. It is destructive to the environment. So here are a people who have faced the onslaught of various stages of capitalism. They were there when the mercantile capitalism unleashed itself. They were there when the industrial capital unleashed itself. And they are the ones who have faced the onslaught of private land ownership, private militias, the Mexican states' advances into the environment and destruction of their communities. So in a way, historically, Zapatistas, along with so many other indigenous groups in the world, are at least in one way experts at understanding the impact of these disasters on their communities and on their lives. But on the other hand, in the ideal decolonial way of thinking, they also are one of the groups that has tried to articulate an alternative. The alternative of radical hope, of strengthening their communities, of keeping the capitalistic acquisition model at bay, and in defending their territories and the nature and their rights. So their historical experience, their understanding of neoliberal capital, and their modes of resistance all then form this praxis that you, me, and everyone else can learn from and maybe modify and use. So I think that is why, even though the three questions that the authors posed in the beginning of this chapter are hard to answer, but if we learn from the Zapatista movement and tailor their practices to our own urban, rural, or indigenous environments, maybe we can come up with a viable alternative to the acquisitive drive of neoliberal capital. And I think that's why this chapter is important, because it gives us a brief history of rise of capital and modernity, but its destructive other side. And then it gives us some hope of learning from the Zapatistas to articulate a different way of living in this world and different practice. Now, on a side note, I also wanted to explain that throughout their discussion of the rise of capitalism and how it unfolds, what the authors are using, without stating it, is that how most of the times capitalism has what we call an instrumental logic. It is governed by instrumental reason. And simply stated, instrumental logic or instrumental reason is reason that is aimed at achieving the ends. And in the process of doing so, it instrumentalizes human beings, instrumentalizes nature. Capitalism as a system is driven by instrumental logic because it must instrumentalize nature, must instrumentalize human labor to produce profits. It's a profit-driven system. And instrumental logic then, by its very nature, is destructive and acquisitive. Against that, what the Zapatistas offer, or other indigenous groups offer, is what we could term as communicative reason. Reason that presupposes that all of us are equal. We have equal rights to land, we have equal rights to clean water and clean air, and that when we come together as communities and defend our rights, we are also defending the planet, and we are articulating a different future, and we are protecting that future. So that's what I get from this chapter so far. Now, I would encourage you to read it deeply and take good notes, and then if you have any questions, please send them my way. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive discussion of the chapter, and I probably missed a lot of things. Please do point those out to me, and I'll be happy to answer those questions. But for right now, this is my brief introduction to Chapter 4 of A Beginner's Guide to Building Better Worlds. Thank you so much. Stay safe. Take care, and I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.